Marcus
Declined?
arrived at
Are
the
you
Shell station
serious?
on
I'm
Riverside
at the
Drive
pump
at
right now.
7:47 a.m.,
Honey, check
already
the
running
account.
behind
It
schedule.
says 0.
His wife Sarah sat in the passenger seat, perfectly still, staring out the window with that distant look she got when she was anxious about something. They'd been married 12 years, he knew her tells better than he knew his own reflection. "You okay?" he asked, pulling up to pump number 4, deliberately choosing the one farthest from the station entrance. Sarah didn't like crowds, never had. "Just tired," she said, but her fingers were locked together in her lap, knuckles white. Long night thinking about the presentation. Sarah was a UX designer at a mid-sized tech firm, and today she was pitching a redesign to their biggest client. Marcus knew she'd been up past midnight, tweaking animations that probably didn't need tweaking. She did this, spun her anxiety into perfectionism and called it ambition. He loved her for it, even though it meant he was constantly watching her run herself ragged. "You're going to crush it," he said, leaning over to kiss her temple. She smelled like coconut shampoo and the coffee she'd left untouched on the nightstand. "Like you always do." She managed a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Promise me you won't let me forget my portfolio?" "It's in the back seat. Right where it's been for the past week." The morning was deceptively beautiful, one of those late spring days where the sky looks almost too blue, like someone cranked up the saturation on reality. Marcus stepped out of their sensible Honda Civic and opened the fuel door. The petrol station was quiet, just the way he liked it. A couple of construction workers loading up their work truck 3 pumps over. An elderly man getting coffee inside. Everything normal. Everything routine. Everything about to explode. Sarah was scrolling through her phone, probably checking emails or obsessing over her deck one more time. Marcus was unscrewing the fuel cap when he heard the sound, a loud, aggressive honk followed by the shriek of tires. His head snapped up. A Range Rover, pristine, black, expensive, had pulled into pump number 3, directly beside them. The woman who emerged moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to never hearing the word no. She was in her early 50s, blonde hair blown out in that salon-perfect way, wearing designer sunglasses despite it being barely past sunrise and the sun being nowhere near aggressive. Athleisure wear that probably cost more than Marcus's monthly car payment. Everything about her screamed money, status, and a deeply internalized belief that the world revolved around her convenience. Finally, she muttered loud enough for Marcus to hear. "This queue is absolutely ridiculous." The queue. There was no queue. The station was empty. She'd simply decided that her arrival superseded everyone else's presence. She began pumping fuel with aggressive, jerky movements, checking her Rolex every 30 seconds like the petrol might somehow refund itself if she wasn't vigilant. She didn't look at Marcus or acknowledge Sarah in any way. They existed only insofar as they inhabited space she felt she should have occupied. Marcus turned back to his own pump, and that's when things started to go genuinely wrong. He heard the woman on her phone before he saw her. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the morning like broken glass. "Yes, Mother, I understand, but honestly, the service at the Four Seasons has really gone downhill. We might have to look at the Ritz for the gala this year." "No, I don't care if it's more expensive, clearly you get what you pay for." She was pacing now, the phone pressed to her ear, her free hand gesticulating wildly as if her mother could see her emphasis. She'd abandoned her fuel pump mid-fill, the nozzle still in her tank, gas slowly accumulating while she performed her phone call like she was an actress in a one-woman show about her own importance. Marcus watched this with a kind of detached horror. Every fiber of his being wanted to say something. He hated confrontation, absolutely hated it, but this was basic safety. An unattended fuel pump was a legitimate hazard. He glanced at Sarah through the window. She was watching too, her anxiety visibly ratcheting up another notch. He made a decision that would cascade into consequences he couldn't have imagined. "Excuse me," Marcus called out, his voice calm, reasonable, friendly. "Just so you know, you probably shouldn't leave your pump unattended. Safety regulations and all that." The woman turned slowly, lowering her phone. Behind those sunglasses, Marcus could see her eyes, that particular breed of contempt that rich people sometimes develop, the kind that looked at regular people and saw a failure of aspiration. She was beautiful in a sharp, predatory way, like an animal that had learned to dress itself in expensive clothes. "I'm sorry, are you speaking to me?" "Just a heads up," Marcus said, keeping his smile pleasant, non-threatening. "The station policy is." "I'm aware of station policy, thanks. I've been coming to this shell for 3 years. They know me." She turned back to her phone call, dismissing him with the casual cruelty of someone who'd built her entire personality around the practice of not seeing people beneath a certain net worth. "Mother, some random man is trying to explain the rules to me at a petrol station." "Yes, I know what to do with petrol. No, I don't need guidance from strangers." Marcus felt heat creep up his neck. Sarah's anxiety had transformed into something else now, protective irritation radiating from her like an aura. She hated people like this woman. They both did. But they also both knew the correct response to people like this woman was to finish their business quickly and pretend the encounter had never happened. He turned back to his pump and focused on the numbers climbing. £32 and 14 pence. £32 and 50 pence. £33. He heard movement behind him, the squealing chirp of the pump being removed, the sound of the fuel door closing. The woman was finally leaving, still on her phone, still talking about the gala, still utterly self-possessed in her wrongness. Marcus watched her slide behind the wheel of the Range Rover. He watched her pull away from the pump. He did not see what happened next, but he felt it. The impact wasn't enormous, more of a hard bump than a collision, but it was unmistakable. The sound of metal on metal. Marcus spun around to find the Range Rover's rear bumper pressed against the driver's side of their Honda. "What the?" Marcus started forward. The Range Rover's door flew open and the woman exploded out of it like she was ejecting from a fighter jet. Her face had transformed into something almost unrecognizable, features twisted by pure adrenaline rage. "You hit me. You hit my car. I have witnesses." She was screaming now, actually screaming, her voice high and fractured. "You came out of nowhere. You hit me." Marcus stopped dead, confused. "What? No, I didn't. I was pumping fuel." You hit my car, you absolute idiot. Do you know what that vehicle costs? Do you have any idea?" Sarah emerged from the Honda, moving with that careful deliberation she used when she was trying not to completely lose it. "He was pumping fuel," she said, her voice precise, controlled. "We watched you pull over. We saw exactly what happened." The woman's eyes locked onto Sarah, and something shifted in her expression, a recalibration. She looked Sarah up and down, and Marcus saw it happen, saw the moment she catalogued his wife as a non-threat, as someone she could bulldoze. "Your husband reversed into me while I was backing out. I have the right to call the police." "That's not what," Marcus started. "Shut up." The woman was already reaching for her phone. "I'm calling the police right now. We'll let them sort it out. And I'm getting your registration number. Your insurance will be hearing from mine." She stood there, phone in hand, sunglasses still on despite the growing morning sun, and dialed. Her voice changed completely when the operator answered, became falsetto sweet, concerned, the voice of an innocent victim. "Yes, hello, I've been in a minor traffic accident at the Shell station on Riverside Drive. The driver fled the scene. Well, no, he's still here, but he's trying to tell me it was my fault. I have witnesses. Yes, my car's been damaged. Yes, I'll stay here." She hung up and stared at Marcus and Sarah with the confident smile of someone who just pressed a button and was waiting for the system to reward her. "Police are on the way," she said sweetly. "We'll see what the truth is, won't we?" Marcus felt his stomach twist into a knot. The time was now 8:03 a.m. Sarah's presentation was at 10:30 a.m., 40 miles away, and they were about to become entangled in something that had absolutely nothing to do with their fault. He looked at his wife's face and saw her anxiety transform into something worse, panic. The woman returned to her Range Rover and sat in the driver's seat with the door open, one foot extended, looking like she was settling in for entertainment. She didn't look like someone who just caused a problem. She looked like someone who just solved one. That's when the manager emerged from the station, a man named Derek who'd been working there for 12 years and had seen everything a petrol station could throw at a human. He looked approximately 65, with the weathered face of someone who'd worked outdoors his entire life and the tired eyes of someone who'd lost his faith in humanity somewhere around year 3. "What's the problem?" he asked, his gaze moving from Marcus to the woman. "This man hit my car," the woman said immediately, pointing at Marcus. "I was backing out of the pump and he rammed into me. I've called the police." Derek's expression didn't change. He looked at Marcus. "That what happened?" "No," Marcus said. "I was pumping fuel. She was parked at pump 3. She got a phone call, left the pump unattended, then when she got back in her car, she backed up and hit us. She's got to have hit us. Look at the damage on the right side of our car and where it connects to her back bumper." Derek looked at the two vehicles, then at the woman, then at Sarah, then back at the woman. His expression suggested he'd already heard this story 100 times, just with different faces and different vehicles. "Let me pull up the footage," he said calmly. "I've got security cameras covering every pump." The woman's face flickered. Just for a moment, just a microsecond, but Derek caught it and Marcus caught it and even Sarah caught it. It was the flicker of someone who'd made a calculation and suddenly realized the calculation might have been wrong. "The footage will show exactly what happened," the woman said, but her voice had lost some of its absolute certainty. "I'm sure it'll prove my point." Derek walked inside without responding. Marcus stood there, his heart hammering, acutely aware that the next few minutes would either vindicate him or destroy the morning entirely. His wife was going to be late to the most important presentation of her career. He could see it happening in real time, could see the timeline splintering into a different version of events. The construction workers had stopped working and were watching now, their crew vehicle forgotten. The elderly man had come out with his coffee and was observing the scene with the resigned interest of someone who'd seen human nature at its worst and worst still. Derek emerged from the station 5 minutes later, his face entirely unreadable. He walked directly to the woman. "I need to make a phone call," he said quietly. "To whom?" the woman asked, but her voice had transformed. The confidence was cracking. Uncertainty was bleeding through. "To your husband," Derek said. "He is your emergency contact, yes. According to your member card that you used inside the station 3 months ago." The woman stood up. "I don't know what." "Your husband's name is Richard Thornton, yes. He works at Thornton and Associates law firm. I have his number right here." The woman's face had gone pale. Genuinely pale. All the color drained out like someone had opened a valve. "Actually, I can," Derek said. His voice was still calm, but there was something underneath it now, anger, yes, but more than that. Disappointment. The disappointment of someone who'd seen the same pattern play out too many times. "Because what I just watched on that footage wasn't what you said happened. What I watched was you deliberately reversing into a parked car while looking directly at it. And I've seen your member information because you've been doing this for 3 years. This is the 4th time you've tried this at my station. Different people, different cars, same story." The woman had stopped breathing. Marcus could see her chest frozen mid-expansion, her face a mask of shock and something darker, the shock of being seen, really seen, for the first time in possibly her entire adult life. "I'm calling your husband," Derek continued, "not to report you to the police, but to let him know what his wife has been doing. Because I've checked, and these other incidents, they stopped getting reported once people's insurance paid out. And I'm thinking your husband might want to know about that pattern." He pulled out his phone and dialed the number. That's when the woman's face collapsed. Not metaphorically. Actually collapsed. The rigidity drained out of her features, and for a moment, Marcus saw something underneath all the armor, something small and desperate and terrified. "Wait," she said. "Wait, don't call him. Please." Derek put the phone to his ear, and the woman lunged forward, her hand reaching out. "Please. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I don't know why I did that. I was having a bad day and I just reacted and, please don't call him." The phone rang. Derek didn't look at her, just waited for an answer. The woman turned to Marcus and Sarah, and Marcus saw actual tears streaming down her face now, mascara running in dark lines down her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm really sorry. Please forgive me." But her eyes weren't looking at them. They were looking past them, looking toward a future she just realized was fracturing in real time, looking toward consequences she'd spent years avoiding. Derek said into the phone, "Hi, is this Richard Thornton?" "Yes, I'm the manager at the Shell station on Riverside Drive. I need to speak with you about your wife's activities here over the past 3 years." And as Marcus watched the woman's final threads of composure unravel completely, as he watched her sink back against her Range Rover like her legs could no longer hold her, he understood something fundamental about the architecture of the universe. The camera was always recording. The witnesses were always watching. And sometimes, justice didn't come from police or courts or any formal system. Sometimes, justice came from a tired manager who'd finally had enough of the same story repeating, and who'd decided that accountability might actually matter more than avoiding confrontation. Derek remained on the phone for another 3 minutes, his voice a steady stream of information. Marcus couldn't hear Richard Thornton's responses, but he could imagine them, the shock, the denial, the desperate hope that his wife's manager must be mistaken. Derek's face remained impassive throughout, a professional delivering unwelcome facts to someone who'd rather they remain buried. "I've got security footage," Derek was saying. "Multiple incidents. The pattern is clear. Yes, I understand this is difficult. No, I don't have documentation of the other incidents at other stations, but I'd recommend checking your insurance claims history from the past 3 years. That's all I have to say. She's right here if you want to speak with her." He extended the phone toward the woman, whose name was, it turned out, Karen Thornton. She didn't take it. She just stared at it like it was a venomous snake. "Take the phone," Derek said, not unkindly. Karen's hand moved like it was moving through water. She brought the phone to her ear, and when she spoke, her voice had transformed into something small and broken. "Richard? Yes, he's telling you the truth. There's something I need to explain." She turned away, her voice becoming inaudible, her shoulders hunched like she was trying to fold in on herself. Marcus heard fragments, "I didn't mean to, and, it was just the one time, and, I don't know why I kept doing it," and finally, despairingly, "I know you're going to leave me." Sarah had moved closer to Marcus, her hand finding his. She was still shaken, but the immediate crisis had passed. They were no longer the focus of the unfolding drama, they'd been absorbed into the supporting cast of what was clearly a much larger story. "Thank you," Sarah said quietly to Derek, who was standing nearby, giving Karen privacy despite the fact that there was no privacy to be had in a petrol station at 8:20 in the morning. "For showing the footage." Derek nodded. "I should have done it the first time," he said. "Should have pushed harder. But the other times, the people just wanted the money. Insurance money changed hands, and everyone moved on. I didn't have proof of the pattern until I started documenting this year." He paused. "I've got maybe 5 more minutes before the police arrive." She called them. Marcus felt his stomach drop. "They're still coming?" "Yeah. She won't cancel now, she's probably in shock. When they show up, tell them the truth and let them see the footage. They'll figure it out pretty quickly." Behind them, Karen was still on the phone, but now she was crying openly, not even attempting to hide it anymore. I don't know what's wrong with me. I don't. I thought if I could make the world acknowledge me, make it respond to me, then maybe I wouldn't feel so invisible all the time. Even Marcus, even with all his anger at what she tried to do to them, felt something shift in his chest. There was real pain in those words. Real, genuine suffering. Karen had tried to destroy their morning out of something deep and broken inside herself, and now that brokenness was exposed for everyone to see. The police arrived at 8:34 a.m., a patrol car with 2 officers, a man and a woman, both looking like they'd seen this exact scene approximately 5,000 times before. They took statements from everyone, listened to Derek's explanation, and asked to review the footage. They were in the station for 7 minutes. When they emerged, the male officer walked directly to Karen, who was still standing by her Range Rover, looking like someone who'd aged 10 years in the past half hour. "Miss Thornton," the officer said, "I'm going to be frank with you. The footage clearly shows that you deliberately reversed into this vehicle while looking directly at it. That's insurance fraud, and it's also potentially dangerous. However, Derek here has chosen not to press charges. He's willing to call this a warning." Karen's head snapped up, surprise and gratitude and something like shame all crossing her face at once. "As for you," the officer continued, turning to Marcus and Sarah, "you're free to pursue this through insurance claims if you'd like, but the surveillance footage makes it clear you were not at fault. Derek can provide copies to your insurance company if needed." They wrapped things up quickly after that. The police left, satisfied that justice had been served in the form of public humiliation and the threat of consequences still hanging over Karen's head. Derek provided them with Derek's contact information and the file number for the incident report, which noted that Karen had been the at-fault party and had initially made a false claim. As Marcus pulled away from the pump, finally starting to fill their tank properly, he watched Karen in his mirror. She was still on the phone with Richard, her voice occasionally rising in distress, her body language screaming defeat. "Do you think she'll be okay?" Sarah asked quietly. Marcus considered this. "I think she will be," he said. "I think this is going to hurt, and I think it should. But I think it might also save her." They drove away from the Shell station at 8:47 a.m. Sarah's presentation was at 10:30 a.m., still 40 miles away. They were going to be late, but only by 15 minutes or so. Manageable. Not ideal, but manageable. Sarah spent the drive in silence, her phone in her lap, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. Marcus knew she was running through contingencies in her head, the way she always did. What she'd say. How she'd apologize for the delay. How she'd make her presentation so compelling that the client would forget they'd been kept waiting. He reached over and squeezed her hand. "You're going to crush it," he reminded her. She squeezed back, and there was gratitude in that gesture, gratitude for more than just the encouragement. Gratitude that they'd stood up for each other. Gratitude that the truth had mattered more than Karen's confidence. Gratitude that there was a Derek in the world who'd bothered to care enough to do the right thing. Sarah's presentation went perfectly, despite the late arrival. She walked into that conference room at 10:46 a.m., portfolio in hand, and spent the next 90 minutes explaining her vision to a group of executives who had clearly already decided to love her work before she started. She was promoted 2 months later, a bump in pay and a team of her own. But the story of Karen Thornton didn't end at the Shell station. Richard Thornton filed for divorce 3 days later. Not because of the scam, he'd apparently known about some of it, suspected even more, and had convinced himself it was a phase, but because of what came next. Once Derek's footage was reviewed by the insurance company, they opened an investigation. They pulled Karen's claims history going back 7 years. There were 14 incidents. 14 different people, 14 different scenarios, all following the same pattern. All fraudulent. The insurance company pressed charges. Karen was arrested on a Wednesday, booked on multiple counts of insurance fraud and filing false police reports. The local news picked it up because it was a slow news day and because Karen had chosen her victims unwisely. One of the people she'd scammed was a journalist's sister, who'd been trying to get the story out for 2 years but had no proof. Suddenly, all of it was public. Karen's face was on the evening news. Her name was in articles. Her entire carefully constructed identity was dismantled in real time, layer by layer, until there was nothing left but the terrified woman who tried to reverse into their car. She eventually took a plea deal, community service, restitution to all 14 of her victims, and a mandatory psychological evaluation that determined she had severe anxiety-driven compulsive behaviors rooted in childhood trauma and deep feelings of inadequacy. None of that made what she did okay. But it did make it understandable in a way it hadn't been at 8:03 a.m. when she'd been screaming about how expensive her Range Rover was. 6 months after the initial incident, Marcus and Sarah received a letter from Karen's attorney. It was a formal letter of apology with details about restitution for the damage to their car. Attached was a personal note, handwritten, from Karen herself. Dear Marcus and Sarah, I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I want to explain, but I know explanations are just justifications, and I'm tired of justifying. I want to say that something was broken inside me and that's why I hurt people. It's true, but it's not an excuse. You didn't deserve what I tried to do to you. Your wife didn't deserve to be late to her presentation because I was having a bad day and decided that made it acceptable to hurt strangers. Your husband didn't deserve to have his morning turn into a nightmare because I was so desperate to feel powerful that I had to destroy someone else's peace. I've been seeing a therapist. I understand now that my need to be seen, to matter, to have the world acknowledge my importance, that was driving everything. And when people didn't see me the way I wanted to be seen, I forced them to see me by hurting them. I've made restitution to everyone. I've been doing community service. I've been trying to understand why I became the kind of person who would do this. I'm not going to beg for forgiveness. I just want you to know that something changed in me that morning. You and that manager, you held me accountable. You didn't let me hide or justify or move on. You forced me to see what I'd become. It took hitting bottom to make me want to climb back up. I hope your wife's career continues to flourish. I hope you both find happiness. And I hope that you can, if not forgive me, at least understand that I'm trying to be better. Karen Thornton. Sarah cried when she read it. Not because she'd forgiven Karen, that process would take time, if it happened at all, but because she recognized the genuine effort in those words, the real attempt at accountability. Marcus felt something too, something complicated and hard to articulate. Empathy, maybe, for the woman underneath the armor. Compassion for how broken she'd had to be to break other people in such calculated ways. But the real twist in the story, the thing that nobody expected, came 3 months later. Derek received a call from corporate Shell. They'd been reviewing his actions on the day of the incident, specifically, his decision to call Richard Thornton before involving police, and they were concerned. They wanted to know if he understood that he could have gotten the company sued. They wanted to know if he'd been trained on proper protocol for these situations. Derek said he had acted according to his conscience. They told him that conscience had no place in corporate liability management. They told him he was being let go, effective immediately, for inappropriate use of customer information and potential violations of privacy policies. Derek, who'd worked at that Shell station for 12 years, who'd been the only manager in the district who'd bothered to review security footage when customers complained, who'd been the reason Karen Thornton's fraud had been exposed, Derek was fired. The story reached social media. People were outraged. A petition started, demanding he be rehired. News outlets picked it up, Good Samaritan manager fired for exposing insurance fraud scammer. The PR nightmare forced Shell's hand, and they rehired Derek, with a public apology and a promotion. But Derek had already decided he was done. He took a job at a smaller, locally owned petrol station for slightly less money but significantly more peace of mind. He told Marcus, when they ran into each other at the grocery store a year later, that the whole experience had broken something in him too, his belief that doing the right thing would be protected, not punished. That belief had taken a hit, but it hadn't broken completely. It was just bent. Damaged in a way that would take time to heal. The real ending of Karen's story came 2 years later. Marcus saw it in a news article he was scrolling through on his phone while waiting at the doctor's office. Karen Thornton had started a non-profit organization for people struggling with compulsive lying and fraud. She was doing public speaking engagements at universities, talking about how psychological damage manifests as destructive behavior, how the shame of those behaviors creates a feedback loop that makes everything worse. She'd turned her damage into a kind of redemption story. Not forgiveness, but the harder work of genuine transformation. Marcus showed the article to Sarah that night. They sat in their living room, the evening news playing silently on the television, and read through Karen's bio. She was different now, not in a superficial way, but in that way that only trauma and therapy and real consequences can make you different. She'd stopped trying to be seen by the world and had started trying to help other people who were drowning in that same desperate need to matter. "Do you think she's actually changed?" Sarah asked. "I think she's trying," Marcus said. "I think that's the best any of us can do." Sarah nodded, and they sat together in comfortable silence, the kind of silence you only get when you've been through something difficult with someone and come out the other side still holding hands. The petrol station at Riverside Drive continued operating normally. Derek's replacement was competent but forgettable. No security footage was ever reviewed with the same care and attention. But Marcus and Sarah never went back there, not because it held bad memories, but because the whole experience had shifted something in how they understood the world. They understood that cameras were always recording. They understood that accountability mattered. They understood that sometimes you had to be willing to stand up to someone powerful in order to protect something fragile, and that sometimes those moments changed everything, not just for you, but for the person you stood up to, for the person who stood with you, and for the entire architecture of what justice and consequence could actually look like when people bothered to care enough to enforce it. Karen had tried to get Sarah arrested at a petrol pump. She'd failed because the truth had been more powerful than her performance, because there was footage, because there was a Derek who cared enough to look. 6 months after the petrol station incident, Marcus started noticing something strange. People were recognizing Sarah in coffee shops, in the grocery store, once even at a restaurant. Not because she was famous, but because the news coverage of Karen's fraud ring had been surprisingly extensive, and Sarah's face had appeared in several articles as one of the primary victims whose case had cracked open the larger pattern. What surprised Marcus was how people reacted. They weren't expressing sympathy, they were expressing something different. Admiration, maybe. Pride. Like Sarah had become an accidental symbol of something larger. Several people told her that she'd given them courage to come forward about their own scams, their own experiences with people who'd hurt them deliberately. Sarah hated it, this unsought visibility. She'd gone into the presentation that day thinking only about her work, her career, her future. She'd come out of it a minor celebrity in the fraud awareness community. News outlets wanted to interview her. Podcasters wanted her story. A true crime documentary was in development, and the producers wanted her to participate. "I didn't do anything," Sarah told Marcus late one night, frustration evident in her voice. "I just stood there and watched." Derek was the one who actually did something. But Derek wasn't willing to do interviews or participate in documentaries. He'd done what he'd done in the moment, and that was enough for him. He didn't need the recognition or the attention. He was happy working at his smaller station, living his quieter life, not needing the world to validate his choices. Sarah eventually agreed to participate in one documentary, just one, with the condition that Derek also be interviewed. She made that participation contingent on Derek getting equal billing, equal presence in the narrative. The producers agreed, not enthusiastically, but they agreed. Derek, reluctant, also agreed, doing it primarily to support Sarah. The documentary aired 18 months after the petrol station incident. It was called The Footage Doesn't Lie, and it became unexpectedly popular, spawning think pieces about accountability, insurance fraud, corporate liability, and the psychology of lying in modern consumer culture. Universities started teaching it in ethics and business classes. People discovered Derek through it, and his quiet life became slightly less quiet, though he handled the attention with the same steadiness with which he handled everything else. But the real ripple effect started with Richard Thornton. Richard had remained largely silent through all of Karen's legal proceedings. He divorced her quietly, divided their assets according to the court's determinations, and moved on with his life. He was a lawyer, after all, he understood how to navigate the legal system, how to protect himself and his interests. He came out of the divorce reasonably intact financially, though his social status had taken a hit. People who knew him in professional circles had questions. Comments about how he hadn't known his wife was committing fraud. Implications that he should have noticed, that he should have done something earlier. What nobody knew was that Richard had known, at least in part, and had chosen not to act. Derek's decision to call Richard that morning had set off a chain reaction that Richard had been desperately trying to manage for 18 months. His wife's crimes were now public knowledge. His failure to report them was now a matter of public record. His firm was facing pressure to explain their hiring practices for someone whose judgment was clearly so compromised that he'd married a woman running an organized fraud scheme and done nothing about it. 6 months after the documentary aired, Richard Thornton made a decision. He called a press conference and made a statement admitting that he'd known about at least some of his wife's fraudulent activities and had chosen not to report them. He stated that he'd been in denial, that he'd convinced himself that Karen's behavior was a phase, that he'd been enabling her out of some combination of love and cowardice. He announced that he was stepping down from his position at his firm, that he was pledging to donate the proceeds from the sale of his house to victims of fraud, and that he was going to cooperate fully with any investigations into his knowledge of his wife's crimes. It was a stunning reversal, not quite a redemption arc, but something like a reckoning. Richard had decided that the only way forward was through complete accountability, complete transparency, complete willingness to face whatever consequences came. His firm stood by him initially, issuing statements about how rare it was for someone to take such a brave step. But the law profession being what it is, there were still repercussions. He was investigated by the Bar Association. It was determined that while he'd technically broken no laws, his ethical obligations as an attorney had been compromised by his failure to report the fraud. He was not disbarred, but he was sanctioned. His reputation in legal circles never fully recovered. Richard seemed to accept this with a kind of relief. He'd been carrying the weight of his choice, or rather his non-choice, for 18 months. Finally facing it head-on, finally publicly acknowledging what he'd done and failed to do, seemed to lighten something in him. 2 years after the petrol station incident, Richard reached out to Marcus and Sarah through a mutual acquaintance. He wanted to meet with them. Marcus was hesitant, this was Karen's husband, after all, the man who'd chosen not to stop her before she tried to hurt them, but Sarah said something that stuck with him, he's trying to be better too. That matters. They met at a coffee shop on a Saturday morning. Richard looked older than he had in the news photos, worn down by his own process of reckoning. He apologized, extensively and specifically. He talked about his complicity. He talked about the ways he'd enabled Karen's behavior through his willingness not to see it. He offered them additional compensation beyond what Karen had already paid, money they didn't need but accepted because refusal would have felt performatively virtuous. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Richard said, echoing almost exactly what Karen had written in her letter. "I'm just asking that you understand that I'm trying to be better." Marcus and Sarah exchanged a look. They'd had time to sit with what had happened. The anger had faded into something more complex, a kind of sad understanding that the people who tried to hurt them were also people who'd been hurt themselves, people who'd been carrying their own damage in ways that had made them dangerous. "We understand," Sarah said. "And yes, you should have done something earlier. But I think it's good that you're doing something now." Richard nodded, thanked them, and left. They never heard from him again, but they followed his life through occasional news articles. He eventually went back to law, but not in private practice. He took a job as a legal advocate for people who'd been victims of fraud. He did pro bono work. He became, in his way, another person who'd been transformed by the events of that morning into someone trying to do better. The petrol station morning had become something like a node in a network of transformation. Everyone it touched had been changed by it, had been forced to reckon with their own complicity or their own responsibility or their own capacity for better choices. The most unexpected ripple came in the form of Karen herself. A year after the documentary aired, Karen published a memoir. It was raw and unflinching, a brutal examination of her own psychology, her own damage, her own choices. She didn't make excuses, she explained. There was a difference. She talked about her childhood, her sense of never being enough, her need to construct a false self that the world would have to acknowledge. She talked about the moment at the petrol station when that false self had been deconstructed in public, stripped away by security footage and a tired manager's willingness to care. She talked about the bottom. About the days when she was in jail waiting for trial, when she faced the reality of what she'd done to 14 different people. She talked about the therapy, the medication, the slow process of understanding herself not as a victim but as someone who'd victimized others out of her own victimization, a cycle she was determined to break. The memoir was painful to read, but it was also undeniably honest. It became, surprisingly, a kind of resources guide for people dealing with their own compulsive lying, their own need to construct false narratives, their own desperate hunger to be seen and validated by a world that felt indifferent to their existence. Sarah read it. Marcus knew because he found it on her nightstand after she'd finished, marked with dozens of highlighter annotations. When he asked her about it, she said, she got it. By the end, she actually understood what she'd done and why. That's not redemption, but it's something. It's the building blocks of redemption. 3 years after the petrol station incident, the local news ran a follow-up story, Where Are They Now? They tracked down each of the 14 victims of Karen's fraud. All of them had recovered, though some had been more affected than others. Several had gone on to become advocates against fraud themselves. One had published her own memoir about the psychological impact of being deliberately victimized. Another had become active in insurance oversight. The story interviewed Derek, who was still managing his independent petrol station and had started a fraud awareness program for small business owners. It interviewed Sarah, who was now running a successful design firm and mentoring other women in tech. It interviewed Richard, who was doing his legal advocacy work. It didn't interview Karen directly, she'd chosen to step back from public life, still doing her nonprofit work but declining media requests. And it interviewed Marcus, who'd started a business consulting firm focused on helping small business owners implement better security practices. The petrol station incident had shifted his entire career trajectory. He'd gone from general project management to a specialization in fraud prevention and security, driven by a visceral understanding of how quickly life could change when people weren't paying attention to the details. The documentary about Derek and Sarah had sparked something larger, a national conversation about fraud, about accountability, about the ways that security systems and human attention could work together to create consequences for people who'd previously operated with impunity. There were legislative discussions. Insurance companies started implementing new protocols. Businesses became more aware of the importance of security footage and trained management staff on what to look for. All of this had started with a woman reversing into a car at a petrol pump, convinced she could get away with it. Marcus often thought about that morning, the blue sky, Sarah's anxiety about her presentation, the casual cruelty with which Karen had dismissed him when he tried to help her. He thought about how one decision, Derek's decision to check the footage, to make the call, to care enough to hold Karen accountable, had rippled out and touched so many lives. He thought about how Karen might have continued her fraud for years, might have hurt dozens more people, if that morning had gone differently. If Derek had called them both liars and sent them on their way. If the footage had been somehow unavailable. If the security system hadn't been working. But it had all lined up just right. And sometimes, Marcus thought, that's what justice is, not a grand system or a perfect institution, but a series of moments where people chose to care enough to look closely, to question the narrative they were being given, to demand that the truth matter more than the convenience of moving on. He never saw Karen Thornton again after that morning. He didn't seek her out, and she didn't seek him. But he thought about her sometimes, the woman she'd been and the woman she was becoming. He thought about how different their lives might have been if she'd just pumped her petrol and left them alone. He thought about what it meant to almost destroy someone and then spend years trying to make it right. He thought about whether redemption was even the right word for what she was doing, or whether reckoning was more accurate. Whether there was a difference between a person who'd hurt you becoming better and a person who'd hurt you getting what they deserved. He'd never quite resolved those questions. But he'd made peace with the uncertainty. That morning at the petrol pump had taught all of them that certainty was often just another form of self-deception, and that sometimes the most honest thing you could do was admit that you didn't have all the answers, that you could understand someone without forgiving them, that accountability could look different for different people, and that sometimes the most important thing was just the willingness to try. 2 years after publishing her memoir, Karen founded what she called the Accountability Institute. It was a nonprofit dedicated to helping people who'd committed fraud or intentional deception understand their own psychology and, more importantly, to make meaningful restitution to their victims. She worked with lawyers, therapists, and victims' advocates to create a framework where people who'd damaged others could systematically work toward genuine accountability. The work was contentious. Victims' rights advocates were skeptical. Some of Karen's own victims didn't want her to profit in any way from the narrative of what she'd done to them. There were heated public debates about whether she was exploiting her crimes for financial gain or whether she was genuinely trying to help other people avoid becoming like her. Karen handled all of this with what seemed to be genuine humility. She donated all the proceeds from her memoir to victim compensation funds. She didn't take a salary from the Accountability Institute, living on modest savings and the money from Richard's divorce settlement, money she'd initially refused but eventually accepted when she realized that refusing it was performative and accepting it allowed her to do actual work. She submitted herself to regular therapy and psychiatric evaluations, sharing the results with her board of directors to ensure she wasn't reverting to old patterns. When one of her board members questioned whether her motivations were actually pure or whether she was just finding a more sophisticated way to be seen and validated, Karen's response was to step down temporarily and undergo additional therapy specifically focused on that question. The board member's concern felt fair to her, it mirrored her own anxieties about herself. How do I know I'm not just finding a more acceptable version of what I was doing before? She asked her therapist during one session that would later be referenced in her second book, a collection of essays about the ongoing process of holding yourself accountable. Her therapist's response was, "You probably can't know, not with absolute certainty. But the fact that you're asking the question, that you're willing to examine your own motives continuously rather than just accepting that you're helping people, is itself a form of accountability. You're not resting on the certainty that you've changed. You're holding yourself to an ongoing standard of questioning." That answer didn't fully satisfy Karen, but it did something more useful than satisfaction. It gave her a framework for existing in her own life without either self-flagellation or self-forgiveness. She could be someone who'd done terrible things and was trying to do better without needing to know, with certainty, whether she'd actually succeeded. Sarah followed Karen's work with a kind of anthropological interest. She'd ask Marcus about news articles mentioning the Accountability Institute. She'd mention if Karen gave a speech somewhere. She'd updated her understanding of Karen over time, not from an enemy to a friend but from a cautionary tale to a kind of proof of concept, proof that transformation was possible, that people could genuinely change if they were willing to do the work. 5 years after the petrol station incident, Sarah received an unexpected invitation. The Accountability Institute was hosting a conference for fraud survivors and reformed perpetrators. They were looking for speakers, people who could talk about what it meant to be on either side of the harm caused by deliberate deception. Sarah was invited as a survivor. Derek was invited as a third party who'd intervened in the pattern. Karen would be there, of course, as the founder and, in many ways, the primary case study of what genuine accountability could look like. Sarah came to Marcus with the invitation. It was printed professionally, invitation style, sent directly to their home. Her name was on it. Derek's name was on it. The names of two of Karen's other victims were on it. Richard's name wasn't on it, though his story was clearly implied in the narrative of the conference. "Do you want to go?" Marcus asked. Sarah considered this for a long time. "I don't know," she finally said. "Part of me wants to see what's come from all of this. Part of me thinks going would be like rewarding her for being less bad than she was." "Those might both be true," Marcus said. "Yeah," Sarah agreed. "They might be." In the end, Sarah decided to attend the conference. She didn't do it for Karen, and she made that clear to herself and to Marcus before she left. She did it because she was curious about what accountability could look like when it was systematic and thoughtful rather than just spontaneous or performative. Marcus didn't attend. He'd never been part of that morning in any way except by being married to Sarah. But Sarah came back from the 3-day conference changed in subtle but significant ways. She wasn't there for a lot of it, Sarah reported. Karen, I mean. She was there, but she wasn't the center of attention. The center of attention was the victims, their stories, what they'd experienced. And Karen sat with that. She didn't try to explain herself or add context. She just sat and listened to people describe the harm she'd caused them, and she didn't look away. She didn't make it about herself. "Did you talk to her?" Marcus asked. "Yes," Sarah said. "Not a deep conversation. Just, we spoke in the hallway between sessions. She thanked me. I told her it wasn't necessary. She said she understood that, but she also understood that some acknowledgement was better than none, and she was going to keep offering acknowledgement even if it wasn't wanted, because the lack of wanting it didn't eliminate the need for it to be offered." Marcus considered this. "That sounds very deliberate." "It is," Sarah agreed. "I think that's the thing I took from the conference. She's very deliberate now. She's not spontaneous or reactive. She's considered every action against the standard of whether it's serving her own need to be seen or whether it's actually serving the work she's trying to do. And when she realizes she can't tell the difference, she recuses herself from the decision." "Do you think she's genuinely different now?" Marcus asked. Sarah took a long time to answer. "I think she's genuinely trying to be different. I think whether she's succeeded in actually being different is a question I can't answer. Only she can answer it, and even she probably can't answer it with certainty. But the fact that she's asking the question, that she's making decisions based on the answer, that she's examining her own motives continuously, that's something different from who she was in the parking lot that morning." "That's not quite an answer," Marcus pointed out. "No," Sarah agreed. "But it's the most honest one I have." Years continued to pass. The petrol station incident became part of the furniture of their lives, something that had happened, something that had changed them, something they referenced occasionally when discussing larger questions about accountability and transformation. But it became less acute over time. The intensity of the memory faded, the visceral anger subsided into something like philosophical interest. Derek continued managing his petrol station. He never married, never seemed particularly interested in romantic relationships, but he built a life that was quiet and purposeful. He mentored young security professionals. He developed training materials on fraud detection. He occasionally gave speeches about the importance of caring enough to look closely, about the responsibility that came with being in a position to prevent harm. Richard eventually remarried, to a therapist he'd met during his own mandatory counseling after the divorce. They had a child together. He built a life that was, by all accounts, genuinely different from the life he'd lived with Karen. His legal advocacy work became his primary focus. He'd never quite returned to the prestige of his former firm, but he'd built something that felt more meaningful, even if it paid less. Karen's life became her work. The Accountability Institute grew. She trained thousands of people in understanding their own cycles of harmful behavior, in making genuine restitution, in living with the knowledge of what they'd done while actively choosing to do better. She never remarried. She lived modestly. She maintained regular contact with her therapist, even after that was no longer required as part of her sentencing conditions. And she never sought forgiveness from the people she'd harmed. She sought acknowledgement. She sought understanding. She sought their willingness to believe that people could change. But she never demanded or even asked for forgiveness, understanding that some harms were large enough that forgiveness might not be the appropriate response. 8 years after the petrol station incident, Sarah was invited to the Accountability Institute's annual conference as a keynote speaker. Not as a victim, they'd moved beyond that framing, but as someone whose life had been transformed by accountability being taken seriously. Marcus attended this time. They sat in the audience of approximately 300 people, many of them victims of fraud, many of them perpetrators who were trying to understand and transform themselves, many of them professionals dedicated to the work of making accountability meaningful. Sarah gave a speech about the morning at the petrol pump. She told the story, not of her as a victim, but of all of them as people trying to figure out how to live better in the aftermath of damage that had been caused. She talked about Derek choosing to care. She talked about Richard choosing to face what he'd done. She talked about Karen choosing to turn her damage into something that could help other people understand themselves. And then, unexpectedly, she talked about Marcus. She talked about standing next to him that morning, feeling his steadiness, knowing that no matter what happened, she wouldn't face it alone. She talked about how accountability wasn't just about individual transformation, it was about community, about having people who would stand with you when things got difficult. Marcus wasn't expecting to be mentioned. He wasn't expecting to feel emotional hearing his name, hearing his wife describe what that morning had meant and how it had connected to every good thing that had happened since. When Sarah finished speaking, there was applause. It was genuine and warm. And as the applause died down, Karen walked onto the stage. This was unexpected. Karen wasn't supposed to be visible during Sarah's talk. She was supposed to be behind the scenes, running the conference, not inserting herself into the narrative. But there she was, and she hugged Sarah. Just briefly, respectfully, not holding on too long or making it about herself. Just a hug that said, "Thank you for your honesty, thank you for not diminishing what happened, thank you for allowing the complexity of accountability to exist." I was supposed to be backstage, Karen said to the audience, to Sarah, to the room. But I wanted to add something, if Sarah doesn't mind. Sarah nodded, curious and a little wary. I wanted to say that the person you should be listening to isn't me, Karen continued. It's Derek. Derek could have done nothing. Derek could have called the police and let them figure it out. Derek could have just let the insurance company sort it out, the way everyone else before him did. But Derek chose to hold me accountable in a way that actually mattered. He didn't punish me, he informed me. He showed me that I was being seen, really seen, and that I couldn't hide anymore. She paused, looking out at the audience. I've spent the past 8 years trying to be worthy of that moment when Derek decided I mattered enough to tell the truth to. I've failed in many ways. I've succeeded in some ways. But mostly, I've just tried to keep showing up and doing the work and being willing to be held accountable not just in the moment, but continuously, every single day. She looked back at Sarah. Thank you for being here. Thank you for trusting me enough to speak at my conference. That trust is something I work toward every day, knowing I may never deserve it. But I'm going to keep trying. She hugged Sarah again, and then she stepped back. Sarah's eyes were shining. Marcus could see the complexity of emotions on her face, the anger that hadn't fully faded, the understanding that had grown, the recognition that Karen was a human being who'd caused harm and was spending her life trying to undo it, knowing she probably couldn't fully succeed. That was the moment that Marcus understood something fundamental about accountability and redemption. They weren't about returning to some previous state of innocence or purity. They were about moving forward with the knowledge of what you'd done and the commitment to do better, knowing that forward movement might never fully erase what came before. The conference continued. Derek gave a presentation on fraud detection methods that had evolved over 8 years of study and practice. Richard gave a talk about legal accountability systems and why they often failed to serve the interests of actual healing. Karen facilitated workshops, introduced speakers, stayed visible but not dominant, supporting the stories of others rather than centering her own narrative. And Marcus watched all of it, and understood that the petrol pump morning had been both an ending and a beginning. An ending of the life they'd been living, innocent of what accountability could really look like, confident that justice was something dispensed by systems rather than built by people choosing to care. And a beginning of a different kind of life, one where they understood that transformation was possible, that people could change if they did the hard work, that accountability required ongoing commitment rather than a single gesture. Late that night, back in their hotel room, Marcus asked Sarah, "Do you forgive her?" Sarah considered this carefully. "I don't know," she finally said. "I think forgiveness implies returning to a previous state of trust. I don't think we'll ever have that. But I think I've made peace with what happened, and I think I've come to understand her as a person, not just as someone who tried to hurt me. That's not quite forgiveness. It's something else. Maybe it's compassion without forgetting. Maybe it's understanding without condoning. Maybe it's just acceptance of complexity." "That sounds lonely," Marcus observed. "It is," Sarah said. "But it's also honest. And I think honesty is more important than comfort." Marcus pulled her close, and they sat together in that hotel room, thinking about the morning 8 years ago that had changed everything, understanding finally that the changes weren't finished. That accountability was ongoing. That redemption, if it could happen at all, wasn't an endpoint but a process that would continue for all of them, Derek, Richard, Karen, Sarah, Marcus, for the rest of their lives. The petrol pump had stopped recording long ago. But the consequences of what had happened there continued to unfold, continued to teach, continued to transform. 10 years after the petrol station incident, Marcus received an email marked personal and confidential. It was from Derek, who'd kept in touch sporadically over the years but had drifted somewhat out of their lives as his own life had become fuller, busier, more engaged with the work he'd committed himself to. The email was brief. "Marcus. I'm writing because I'm being offered a position as the head of corporate security for one of the national petrol station chains. It's a significant opportunity, and before I accept, I wanted to talk to you and Sarah about something. I've been thinking about that morning for a decade. I've been thinking about the choice I made to look at the footage instead of accepting the narrative I was being told. That choice has defined my entire life since then, professionally and personally. It's opened doors, created opportunities, led me to work I find meaningful. But it's also sometimes felt like a weight. Like I'm expected to always be the person who saw the truth when everyone else was blind. Like I have to live up to the version of myself that the documentary created. The corporate position would give me the power to implement the kind of security protocols and accountability systems I've been developing for a decade. But it would also put me back into a system, back under oversight, back where decisions have to be run through multiple levels of management. I wanted to talk to you before I decided. You're one of the few people who was actually there, who knows what that morning meant in real time rather than in retrospect. I value your perspective." Marcus showed Sarah the email, and they agreed to call Derek that evening. When he picked up the phone, he sounded different than he had in their last conversation several months prior, more uncertain, less solid. "I'm offering you the job, pretty much," Derek said after brief pleasantries. "Head of Corporate Security. I'd be implementing systems across 342 petrol stations in the US and UK. I'd have real authority, real resources, real ability to prevent the kind of fraud that happened at my station." "That sounds incredible," Sarah said carefully, hearing the hesitation underneath his excitement. "It does," Derek agreed. "But I've been at my independent station for a decade. I've built something there. I know every person who works for me. I know the community. I can call all the shots. And I'm thinking about walking away from that to join a corporate structure where I'll probably spend half my time fighting with middle management." "But the impact would be bigger," Marcus pointed out. "Would it?" Derek asked. "Or would the impact just be spread thinner? Would I be an advocate for accountability, or would I be a corporate security officer implementing liability management? Are those the same thing? They talked for an hour. Derek explored his doubts and his hopes and his fears about what accepting the position would mean for the person he'd become, the life he'd built. Sarah and Marcus pushed back gently, asking questions rather than offering answers. By the end of the conversation, Derek hadn't decided anything. But he seemed less uncertain just from the act of speaking it out loud. "I'm going to sleep on it," he said. "I'll let you know what I decide." He called back 3 days later. He'd decided to accept the position. He was giving 2 weeks' notice at his current station. He was starting the new job on a trial basis for 6 months, with the option to return to independent work if it didn't feel right. Marcus and Sarah were happy for him, genuinely, but they also recognized that Derek was walking into something uncertain. A corporation couldn't protect him the way his own business had. There would be politics, compromise, politics, compromise. The simplicity of his previous life, managing his station, doing his work, being visible and present, would be traded for the complexity of managing systems at scale. 6 months later, Derek resigned from the corporate position. He called Marcus to explain, "They wanted me to implement security protocols that were designed primarily to protect the company from liability rather than to catch fraud. They didn't want me to investigate questionable incidents too closely because if I found fraud, it would have to be reported, and that meant legal costs, reputational damage, loss of business." "That's corporate liability management," Marcus said. "That's what you knew would happen." "I know," Derek said. "And I tried to work within it, tried to find ways to protect people while also protecting the company. But it's impossible. The interests fundamentally conflict. So I left." He returned to his independent station, to his life of managing his own space, to training security professionals, to giving speeches about accountability. He turned down 2 other corporate offers over the years, understanding that his particular gift, the ability to care enough to look closely, to make the right choice even when it was difficult, wasn't a gift that translated well into systems that needed people to optimize for corporate interests. That choice, Derek told Marcus during another conversation, was the second most important decision of his life. The first was choosing to check the footage that morning. The second was choosing to remain small rather than becoming large, choosing to stay aligned with his principles rather than trading them for impact at scale. "I think about the people I'm not helping because I'm not in that corporate position," Derek said. "But I think about the people I am helping directly, and I think that's worth more to me than the hypothetical impact of a system I don't fully control." Years passed. Sarah's design firm became increasingly successful. She won awards, was featured in industry publications, hired a team of 15 designers who worked on projects ranging from mobile apps to website redesigns. She was doing exactly what she'd set out to do that morning when she was so nervous about her presentation. She was changing the way people experienced digital interfaces, making them more intuitive, more human, more aligned with actual user needs. Richard continued his legal advocacy work. His firm became well known for taking cases of fraud victims who couldn't afford traditional representation. He built relationships with prosecutors, with insurance companies, with other lawyers who believed, like he did, that accountability had to come from somewhere in the system, even if the formal systems didn't always provide it. Karen's work also expanded. The Accountability Institute had trained thousands of people in understanding and transforming their own harmful behaviors. She'd trained therapists, lawyers, corporate compliance officers. Her books had been translated into multiple languages. She'd been invited to speak at universities and conferences around the world. And yet, for all this expansion and success, all 4 of them, Derek, Sarah, Richard, and Karen, remained tethered to that morning at the petrol station. It was the event around which their stories orbited. It was the moment that had determined the arc of their lives. 15 years after the incident, Karen did something unexpected. She published a book written specifically for the people whose lives had been most directly affected by that morning. She called it, "The Weight of Being Seen, Letters to the People Who Changed My Life." The book contained letters to Derek, To Sarah and Marcus. To Richard. To each of the other 13 people she'd scammed. In each letter, she talked about what it had meant to have that person show up in her life at that particular moment. What their choice to be honest, or to stand by their principles, or to eventually reckon with their own failings had meant for her. In the letter to Derek, she wrote, "You saw me. Not the version of myself I was performing, not the carefully constructed identity, not the false confidence. You saw the actual fraud underneath all of it. And instead of letting me hide, instead of letting me run away and continue hurting people, you held me accountable in a way that changed my entire life. I'm not sure you understand what you did that morning. I don't think Derek the person was trying to save Karen the woman. You were just trying to protect the system from being manipulated. But in doing that, you saved me from becoming someone irredeemable. You stopped the pattern before it destroyed me completely. I think about that often. I think about how your choice to care, your willingness to look at the footage, your decision to make the call, I think about how that created a path for me to become better. Not good. Not redeemed. Not forgiven. But better. I wanted you to know that." In the letter to Sarah, Karen wrote, "You were afraid of being late to your presentation. You were already running on anxiety and exhaustion, and I added my own crisis on top of that. I tried to take something from you out of my own desperation to matter. What I didn't understand then, what I've spent 15 years understanding, is that you already mattered. You mattered so much that the world had to have a reckoning when I tried to diminish you. Your work was so valuable that people cared enough to hold me accountable when I tried to make you small. I've spent 15 years doing the work that I should have been doing from the beginning, the work of mattering genuinely instead of seeking validation through destruction. I wanted you to know that I see you, actually see you now, the way I couldn't that morning. I see your talent, your integrity, your genuine desire to make the world better through your work. And I'm grateful that you didn't let me destroy that you stood up instead of folding." To Richard, Karen wrote about how his eventual accountability had given her permission to fully embrace her own. She wrote, "You enabled my behavior for years. You knew and you chose not to act. And then one day you chose to act, to be honest, to face the consequences. That choice meant more to me than you probably realize. It meant that accountability wasn't a punishment inflicted by the system. It was something a person could choose to embrace. Thank you for showing me what that looked like." The book was published simultaneously with a documentary series that featured all 4 of them, Derek, Sarah, Richard, and Karen, discussing that morning, discussing what it had meant, discussing how their lives had unfolded in the 15 years since. Derek watched the documentary and cried, something he'd rarely done in the 2 decades since his wife had died. He cried because he saw himself clearly reflected, saw what his choice had meant in ripples spreading outward through 4 lives, through thousands of people who'd been affected by the work that had grown from that morning. Sarah watched the documentary and was struck by how small the incident seemed when reflected back. The panic, the fear, the sense that something huge was happening, it seemed quaint in retrospect. But also profound. Because small moments were where transformation happened. Large, abstract injustices were too overwhelming to fix. But small moments, individual moments, moments where one person chose to look closely and another person chose to stand firm, those moments could cascade into change. Richard watched and thought about how much time he'd wasted enabling harm before he'd finally chosen to stand against it. He thought about how many people he could have protected if he'd acted earlier. But he also recognized that he was doing better now, that his current work was meaningful, that he'd transformed his complicity into advocacy. Karen watched alone, in her apartment, and let herself cry for the first time in years. Not tears of self-pity or seeking sympathy, but tears of recognition. Tears of understanding what she'd almost become if that morning had gone differently. Tears of gratitude for the people who'd cared enough to stop her. After the documentary aired, Derek called Marcus. "I want to do something," he said. "Something meaningful. I want to create a scholarship fund in the name of that morning. For people who are trying to transform themselves, trying to move from harm to healing. I want to help them the way I was helped. We'll help, Marcus said immediately. Sarah and I will contribute. Within a year, the Petrol Pump Trust was established. It provided scholarships to people who were undergoing therapy for compulsive lying and fraud, who were trying to make restitution to their victims, who were genuinely committed to transformation. By the 20th anniversary of the incident, the trust had helped 342 people. The number seemed like synchronicity, exactly the number of petrol stations Derek would have managed in that corporate position. 20 years after the petrol station incident, Derek passed away. He was 68 years old, died suddenly of a heart attack at his station, collapsed while checking the footage from his security cameras. It was poetic in a way that would have made him uncomfortable if he could have known it. Hundreds of people attended his funeral. The director of the Petrol Pump Trust spoke about how Derek had changed her life. Several people whom he trained as security professionals spoke about his impact on their careers. Sarah gave a eulogy about the man who'd seen the truth when everyone else was blind, who'd cared enough to look closely, who'd made accountability real in a world that often treated it as abstract. Karen attended the funeral. She sat in the back, alone, and cried quietly. When the service was over, she approached Sarah and Marcus and embraced them without speaking. Words seemed unnecessary. Derek's death was a reminder that the choices we make, the people we stand up for, the moments we decide to care, those things echo far beyond our own lifespans. In his will, Derek left a substantial sum to the Petrol Pump Trust. He left his petrol station to be converted into a training facility for security professionals. He left his notes, his research, his entire body of work on fraud detection and accountability systems to be preserved and studied. And he left letters. Letters to Derek, Sarah, Richard, and Marcus, to be opened after his death. Marcus opened his letter at home, alone, and found Derek's handwriting, steady and precise. Marcus. I've been thinking about that morning for 20 years. I've been thinking about the moment when you stepped forward and told me about the unattended fuel pump. That moment was when the pattern started. If you hadn't said anything, if you'd just let Karen do her thing, everything would have been different. I've wondered sometimes if you regret that moment. If you wish you'd just stayed silent, just pumped your fuel, just walked away like most people do. But I also know that you didn't. And I know why. Because people like you, people who care enough to notice the small wrongness, people who are willing to risk confrontation to protect a system or a person, those people are the actual foundation of accountability. I was the one who looked at the footage. I was the one who made the call. But I was only able to do that because you had the courage to speak first. Thank you. Not just for that morning, but for being the kind of person who would speak at all. Derek. Marcus held the letter and cried, crying for Derek, for the morning that had changed everything, for the weight of choices and consequences and the fact that sometimes one small moment could define an entire life. Sarah opened her letter and found this. Sarah. That morning, you were worried about being late to your presentation. You were anxious and tired and just trying to get through the day. And then I showed up and complicated everything. I've thought about that a lot. I've thought about how fragile that moment was, how easily it could have broken you completely. How your life could have splintered in different directions. But it didn't. You stood up. You told the truth. You went to your presentation. You built a life of meaning and success. I think that's the real lesson of that morning. It's not about the fraud or the accountability. It's about the fact that when we stand firm, when we refuse to let ourselves be gaslit or manipulated, when we trust ourselves, we emerge stronger. Thank you for showing me what that looks like. Derek. Richard's letter talked about redemption and the possibility of change. Karen's letter was the longest, talking about sight and blindness, about the transformation that could happen when someone chose to really see another person. And there was one more letter, addressed simply, to whoever reads this after my death. It contained Derek's final thoughts, his lifetime of understanding about accountability. Accountability doesn't come from systems. Systems are just frameworks. Accountability comes from people choosing to care enough to look closely, to question the narratives they're being told, to make themselves vulnerable by standing up for what's right. It comes from Derek checking the footage. It comes from Sarah refusing to accept the lie. It comes from Richard eventually facing what he'd known. It comes from Marcus having the courage to speak first. It comes from thousands of people, every single day, choosing to care when it would be easier not to. That's what I've learned. That's what I've tried to do with my life. That's what I hope I've helped others to do. The petrol pump that morning wasn't magic. It was just a place where people made choices that mattered. Where accountability became real. I hope you carry that forward. I hope you'll be the person who looks closely when everyone else is blind. I hope you'll be the person who speaks first. I hope you'll be someone who transforms their complicity into accountability. The letter was printed and framed and hung in the training facility that used to be Derek's petrol station. Hundreds of people who came through that facility read those words and understood that they were standing in the presence of something sacred, not sacred in a religious sense, but sacred in the sense that something real and important had happened there, something that mattered beyond the individual people involved. 10 years after Derek's death, Sarah published her own book, a memoir of that morning and the 20 years that followed. She called it, The Footage, because that's what it ultimately came down to, the documentation of truth, the inability to hide, the power of evidence to force people toward accountability. In the book, she described Derek and Derek's death and Derek's letters and the way that one morning had defined her life and transformed not just her, but everyone it touched. The book became an unexpected bestseller. Universities taught it in ethics classes. Support groups for fraud victims used it as a resource. People who'd committed fraud and were trying to transform themselves read it as a roadmap for what accountability could actually look like. Marcus built a foundation in Derek's name, funding security training and fraud prevention education. He gave speeches about that morning, about the choice to care, about the power of systems and human attention working together. Richard continued his legal advocacy work until he retired at 70, spending his final years mentoring younger lawyers who were interested in helping fraud victims. Karen eventually stepped down from the day-to-day operations of the Accountability Institute, transitioning leadership to someone else while remaining as a consultant and continued speaker. She'd spent 30 years trying to undo the damage she'd caused, and while she never quite believed she'd succeeded, she'd built something meaningful and helpful in the process. The petrol station was eventually closed permanently, preserved as a kind of memorial to that morning. It became a training facility, a place where people came to learn about accountability, about fraud detection, about the power of systems and human attention. And sometimes, in the early morning, a manager would walk through that facility and look at the pumps, even though no one had pumped fuel there in years, and think about that morning when everything changed. That morning when one woman tried to destroy a couple with a lie, when one man decided to look at the footage, when another man decided to speak first, when a fourth man eventually took responsibility for what he'd failed to do. That morning when accountability became real, not as a concept but as a lived experience, as a force that rippled outward and touched thousands of lives. That morning at a petrol pump, when the camera was always recording, when the truth mattered more than convenience, when people chose to care enough to hold each other accountable. That morning, which was really just like any other morning, but which became the moment that defined everything that came after. 25 years after that morning, Marcus sat in his office in the downtown design district where Sarah's firm had recently expanded. The walls were covered with awards, with framed photographs of projects completed, with images of the digital spaces Sarah had helped create that touched millions of lives. He thought about Derek. Derek, who'd been dead for 5 years now. Derek, who'd made one choice that morning and spent the rest of his life helping other people understand what that choice meant. He thought about Karen. Karen, who'd spent 25 years trying to undo the damage she'd caused, who'd built an entire institute around the principles of accountability and transformation, who'd never quite stopped questioning whether she'd truly changed or was just finding more sophisticated ways to hide. He thought about Richard. Richard, who'd eventually found peace in advocacy work, who transformed his complicity into commitment, who'd spent decades helping people that his earlier self would have never allowed him to see. And he thought about the question that Derek had posed in that final letter, the question that still didn't have a clear answer: how do you know if you've truly changed, if accountability is real, if redemption is possible? The answer, Marcus had come to understand, was that you didn't know. You could never know with absolute certainty. All you could do was keep trying, keep questioning, keep being willing to look closely at yourself and your actions and the consequences of your choices. All you could do was what Derek had done that morning: care enough to look at the footage, care enough to see the truth, care enough to hold people accountable even when it was inconvenient. All you could do was what Sarah had done: refuse the lie, stand firm, trust yourself even when you were terrified. All you could do was what Richard had done: eventually face what you'd failed to do, accept the consequences, spend the rest of your life trying to do better. All you could do was what Karen had done: spend 25 years, 30 years, the rest of your life trying to understand yourself, transform yourself, help other people understand and transform themselves. Marcus pulled out his phone and texted Sarah, "I was thinking about that morning. Do you ever still think about it?" Sarah responded immediately, "Every day. Not because I'm trapped in it, but because I haven't finished learning from it yet." Marcus smiled. That was Sarah. Always learning, always growing, always understanding that the work of transformation was never finished. He thought about the petrol pump, which was now a museum of sorts, preserved as a place where accountability had become real. He thought about the thousands of people who'd walked through there, who'd read Derek's letters, who'd been inspired or challenged or changed by the story of that morning. He thought about all the petrol pumps in all the world, all the places where lies were being told right now, where people were being manipulated, where fraud was happening. He thought about all the directs that might be out there, people who were noticing the truth but didn't have the courage or the clarity to act on it. He thought about what Derek had said: accountability doesn't come from systems, it comes from people choosing to care enough to look closely. Marcus decided that he would go to the memorial that evening, to the preserved petrol station that had become a training facility. He would walk through it and remember that morning. He would stand at pump number 3, where Karen had stood with her unattended fuel nozzle and her desperate need to be seen. He would stand at pump number 4, where he'd stood with Sarah, trying to help. And he would remember that on that morning, in that moment, everything had hinged on Derek. Derek choosing to look. Derek choosing to care. Derek choosing to make the truth matter more than convenience. That morning had been both insignificant and profound. Nothing dramatic had happened. No one had died. No massive crime had been prevented. A woman had tried to lie her way out of a situation and had been caught. But that morning had changed everything. Marcus put on his coat and prepared to leave his office. Sarah was meeting him at the memorial. Richard had texted earlier to say he might join them. Karen had sent a message that she was thinking of Derek today, which was what Karen did on days that mattered. She was present in her absence, honoring the moment without centering herself in it. As Marcus walked out of his office, down the hallway, out into the street, he thought about the question Derek had raised in that final letter: how do you know if accountability is real? And he finally understood the answer. Accountability was real when it changed people. When it rippled outward. When it created a chain reaction of transformation that went on for 25 years and counting. When it made people care enough to look closely, to tell the truth, to keep trying to be better. Accountability was real when a man would go to the memorial of a petrol station 25 years after an incident to remember the morning everything changed. Accountability was real when a woman would spend her entire life trying to undo the damage she'd caused, knowing she probably couldn't fully succeed but doing it anyway. Accountability was real in the small moments, in the choices to speak or remain silent, in the decision to look at the footage or accept the narrative. Accountability was real in the most human way possible, imperfect, ongoing, never finished, always requiring another person to care enough to stand firm. As Marcus walked through the city toward the memorial, as the evening light turned golden and warm, he understood that the work wasn't over. The work of accountability, the work of transformation, the work of standing up for truth and justice and the profound power of a single person choosing to care.